morning and welcome to Galway Politics Live for our 2020 election special. We're here with a number of candidates in Galway West, and I want to introduce you to my co-host Mike Geraghty. Mike is going to introduce the candidates one by one, if that's okay.
Great, thanks Niall. So good morning folks and welcome to Galway Politics Live. So this morning we have 4 candidates that are all running in the election on February the 8th, and we're going to give them all a minute to discuss themselves and the issues they've met on the doors. So without further ado, we'll start off with Eamon Ó Cuív.
Well, my name's Eamon Ó Tuathail. I have had the privilege of serving for some considerable time in Galway West as a TD. I have huge interest in a wide range of issues. Obviously, I live in Connemara, but my office is in Galway City. There are huge problems in the city, but the problems of Connemara and the problems of the city are actually caused by big policies that conflate both problems. There's too rapid growth in the city, and therefore the housing and the traffic problems and so on arise in the city because we're moving people unnecessarily from rural areas. And on the other hand, when you go back to West Connemara in particular, back from, we'd say, Rosmuck back around to Loughnane, you find the other problem, and that is depopulation, because people have had to move into the city many, many times, not because they choose to do so, but because there's a lack of opportunities.
Okay, that's great, thanks a lot. So Niall Ó Tuathail?
Niall Ó Tuathail. So I suppose my background is in health reform, so I do a lot of work for the NHS in England and Scotland, fixing different parts of the health system. I'd like to be in the Dáil working on fixing the health system here in Galway. I think a big part of what's coming up at the doors for me is really this raw deal that young people have in particular growing up in Ireland. So basically the cost of housing, the cost of living has exploded over the last 10-20 years, and it's not fair for young people starting out, can't get a house either to buy or to rent, can't afford to raise families. I had one friend of mine who told me the other day, you know what, Niall, and he's been in his 30s, I've just had to come to terms with the fact that I'm never going to be a dad. That's the kind of reality for young people in Ireland today, and I think we can fix that through having good public services, so having a good public health system, so we don't need to have private health insurance, a good public transport system, so we don't need to have 2 cars, get the state building housing again like we did in the 50s and 60s. That's the kind of way that we fix this raw deal.
That's great, thanks very much, thank you Niall. Pauline?
Hi, I'm Pauline O'Reilly. I'm running for the Green Party. I'm currently a councillor for the Greens, and we were delighted that we got 3 Greens elected as councillors between Connemara and the city. And I think people are really responding to wanting something different and something new, and ensuring that we're not going from election cycle to election cycle, but we're actually guaranteeing the future, the long-term future, the well-being of our society. Certainly for me, I believe that if we fix communities and if we get community right, we get everything right, because community is about sustainability. It's about ensuring that we have GPs in rural areas. That part of our programme for government is a massive investment in rural communities and in housing, particularly public housing. If our model of housing would be that if we have 30% public housing, that'll create a downward pressure on the market and the private market, and ensure that we have a fairer rent for all. That's certainly the direction that is the most sustainable. Massive retrofitting is required so that people aren't feeding into an energy system that is actually making them poorer. So look, there's an awful lot to talk about during the course of the hour, and I'm happy to discuss it more fully at that time.
That's good.
But I'll pass over to Joe now.
Thank you very much.
Joe.
Cheers, my name's Joe Loughnane. I'm running in the general election for People Before Profit. My background would be in anti-racism, community development, and I suppose general activism on most kind of various campaigns around the city and the county. My candidature is based more on defending public services and the kind of general drive down of public services that has happened over the successive governments. On the doors, it's quite clear that people are fed up of seeing tourists living in houses and homeless people living in hotels and hostels. We've gone the wrong way there. In relation to public transport, again, people are looking for excuses to leave the car at home. And then when it comes to our main hospital, people are sick of seeing every single week, our main public hospital coming out as the worst when it comes to waiting lists and trolleys and other aspects of the health service. I think my candidature and what I stand for is about representing a more equal Galway, about unfair taxes and unfair insurances and unfair charges not being hoisted upon the people of Galway, and also trying to establish a real link between those who suffer from rural isolation and those who are living in the city who feel like as if they are kind of dominated by tourists and big business and don't feel like as if the interests of the people of Galway are represented at a national level.
That's fine, Joe. Thanks.
Yeah, so I mean, it's great that we have at least one candidate from the county area as well, because I mean, a lot of what we're talking about is city focus. But the first topic that we really want to touch on is housing and indeed homelessness. You know, and obviously we'll bring into that the whole issue in relation to disabilities and housing disabilities particularly. So, you know, I'd like to sort of get some views from the candidates as to what are the sort of key things in the area of housing that are coming up. Are people talking about homelessness? Are they talking about the fact that they can't get, you know, they can't get a house themselves, or that they're finding the rent to be too expensive, or the cost of housing? What are the issues coming up? I suppose we start ladies first. I mean, Pauline, do you have any... what experience have you actually had?
Absolutely. I mean, I have long experience anyway before I got involved in politics in relation to housing, and particularly for families. And I've been involved in a housing linkage group for a couple of years, so I would meet with Simon and Cope and those.
Yeah, but that's the thin end.
Yeah, that's the thin end of the thin end of the wedge is homelessness, and people do express that, because I genuinely feel people care not just about themselves but about other people in society. That comes up on the doors. But, you know, the larger end of that same wedge is the lack of affordability for people in rental accommodation, the lack of security of tenure. And as a solicitor, that's my background originally, the law just does not secure proper long-term tenancies for people. So I think that they really hear that message, and that they really want to express how they're feeling about the concerns that they have for their grandchildren, for their children, in a system that is actually still being presented to us in all of the councils across the country, of increasing more and more money into a private sector, really incentivising a private market, and they understand that, and they see it every day.
And if the Greens get into government, what's going to be the big ticket thing? And I just a very quick answer to that.
On housing.
Yeah.
On housing in particular, cost rental is our model. It's the Vienna model of housing, and it would
and what
be.
Does that mean?
It would be building public homes, and we're not talking about social versus private. We're talking about public homes, which is that the local authorities will build homes on our own public land instead of selling them off all of the time, selling off land. And it means that it doesn't cost the state anything, because it gets the return back on the cost of building it, but it means that it also isn't a method of deriving profit from individuals.
Okay, I want to ask Niall the same question. I mean, what's coming up for you in relation to the whole issue of housing on the doors? Is it the same thing, or is it...
Yeah, well, first, I wouldn't accept that this is just a city issue. So I think there's lots of people in the county and in Connemara that like have serious housing issues.
Well, we'll come to Eamon Ó Tuathail next as well.
And what's well, I mean, there's more than one person out canvassing in Connemara.
I hope so. I hope none of the city candidates are ignoring the rest of their constituents.
and I'm out in Connemara quite a lot. And I think
I hope Eamon isn't ignoring the city either.
And what I want to say, I mean, we're laughing here, but this is a deadly serious issue, and we have a humanitarian crisis right now, and actually it's going to get worse, because we have a shortage around 4,000 or 5,000 homes in Galway. And we're not even building enough right now to keep up with population growth, let alone eating into the deficit. So it's very important now that we get building at scale, and we need to
building what though? Building social houses, building affordable houses,
a mix. And what we can't keep doing is building. We actually have, if you look at some of the evidence, we have enough 3 and 4 bedroom homes, and what we need are a lot of 1 and 2 bedroom homes, and we need bigger homes, and we need a different mix of housing.
And what about
and
families? Because they tend to get sort of left behind, especially bigger families.
Yeah. So you need a different. You need a different mix. Well, what you have is a lot of students or young professionals who are living together in 3-4 bedroom homes that really should be for families, and they'd love to be living by themselves.
And then of course
the
homeless people
the
are all living in the hotels now, so you know families are. Airbnb is kicking people out.
Yeah.
Is Airbnb coming up?
It is a bit, but I think this is I think Airbnb is definitely an issue, but it's a massive issue.
Over 1,000 houses in Galway.
It's a massive issue, but
30,000.
it's a massive issue. But the biggest issue is building new homes.
Okay.
Because even if we got every one of those Airbnb homes working, like, there's still not enough, and so we need to be building more.
So from a city candidate who has a focus on Connemara, I'd like to go to a Connemara candidate who might have a focus on both.
Yeah, of course, everyone forgets that I was brought up in Dublin. I come from
I
Dublin, and I'm Dublin, but you know better because you know the area I come from.
Yeah.
And the reality is, when I do the constituency work in Connemara, housing is not the biggest issue. It comes up reasonably regularly, and it comes up in various guises. But when I go into the city, it is the totally predominant issue, and homelessness would be the people coming to me. So if we look at the city problem, first of all, people, my experience of people is they do not want to be dependent long term on private rented. They would put up a private rented for a short term, but they want to get security of tenure, and what they want is to be allocated a public house with the aspiration sometime in the future that they might purchase the public house. In other words, a social house built by the the local authority. Now, the second thing that obviously comes up is the issue of affordability for people who are working and cannot afford the inflated prices that are there. And there has to be clear policies, and we have them, to provide houses at an affordable cost to people. And again, with public land, we must use for that. Now, when I go out to Connemara, the problem's slightly different.
Yeah.
The issues in Connemara that I'm getting are, first of all, a total refusal by Galway County Council, I think backed up by the department, each side blames the other, to build houses as they did traditionally on a site provided, where there is a site available, by a local landholder. In other words, you often get a small farmer in Connemara who would be able to give a son, daughter a site, or an uncle might give a site to the local authority to build the local authority house on it.
You're talking about one-off houses now particularly, are you?
Well, I'm talking about that some people want to go into schemes, other people would like to live beside their parents because they'd have the social backup of parents being able to look after their children, babysitters, and then they'd be able to look after their parents in their own, as their parents get older.
Could those be built as social houses rather than necessarily in the ownership of the particular landowner? Because there's
they would be in the owner. What happened? Yeah. What used to happen in the old day? You sold the site at €100 nominal amount to the local authority. They built it a house, and you rented it back. But it was adjacent to where you came from, so it cut down the carbon footprint hugely in travelling for family reasons. Now, the other one that comes up all the time in Connemara, it's a huge issue in relation to housing, is there's a huge ethos in rural Ireland of self-help. And what they're looking for is planning permission for family homes. And they find it very, very difficult to get those planning permission, even where you can site these houses in such a way that they're not obtrusive on the landscape.
But you know as well as I do, Eamon, that many people, they get the planning permission for the family home, and, sure as eggs, a few months later, after it's built, it's sold to somebody who's outside of the...
They are tied.
Is there a clause on that?
There is, absolutely, and there has been for the last 20 years. And I was one of the people who proposed this because I saw that happening in my early years in politics. I was totally opposed to it. In 1997, I shouldn't admit that.
And yet it does happen.
But it very rarely happens, and I'll explain why. If you get planning permission, first of all, you have to provide a lot of evidence that you are genuinely available to work within a commuting range, and that you were brought up with the area of connection. Then when you get the planning permission, you're required to sign a clause that goes on the deeds of the property that says it cannot be sold, and that is enforced rigidly. Now, we get hard cases at times where people want to sell properties for, in many times, valid reasons, and it can be very difficult. So any myth that's out there, I know of the few cases where
there
people
are cases,
but you're talking about a tiny minority of cases. The vast majority of people who look for a planning permission and get it in an area like Connemara, they're tied legally. Therefore, the only way you would manage to sell it is if you had somebody very, very wealthy and they were a cash buyer, and they weren't going to be concerned that they didn't legally have planning permission for the house. If you had to borrow anything for a house and you tried to buy it, you'd find out that the bank wouldn't lend you money because of this inurement clause, which would invalidate the planning, because, as you know, you need a certificate of compliance to borrow any money.
Before I go to Joe, Fianna Fáil have a record, and I'll give you credit for this, a record of being the party who has built the most social houses in terms of government over the years. I mean, you're talking about private ownership of families, and that's you know that's as it may be. But in terms of social housing, there's a real big need in the city at the moment.
But that's what I said first. I said we need to have 2 levels.
Is Fianna Fáil in government going to build
houses.
Social houses? As
Yes.
opposed I noticed carefully you said affordable houses.
No, sorry. I said first social housing, and I emphasized. In fact, what I said was
how many
I
social
used the
houses
word.
are you going to build?
Sorry, I used the word public, and then I thought people might think I meant pubs. So I rephrased it. I rephrased it, and if you play back the tape, you'll find I rephrased it to saying local authority or social houses. Now, there's nobody who knows more the need for that, because there are literally queues into my clinic every Monday afternoon, person after person, in B&Bs, in hotels, etc., and it is absolutely pitiful. And a lot of these are families. Now, in relation to the issue that was raised by Niall here, I agree that we have to look at what the demand is for 1 beds, 2 beds, 3 beds, 4 beds and 5 beds in some cases, and we have to supply all of the demand as it is required. And any private renting should be absolutely a minority and should be more a temporary thing than a permanent thing. Tenure is very, very important in Ireland, and I wouldn't agree with long-term renting leases for people. I think people want to own their houses in this country.
Okay, now Niall wants to get in there, but first I want to get to Joe, because you described yourself as a far left candidate, Joe.
Yes.
I hope I'm not defaming you with that.
Principled left. But
Principled left, okay, but what's been your experience on the doors?
Well, I mean, I'm a renter, so when I go to the doors, I say it straight out that I rent off a private landlord, and the vast majority of people I speak to are often of the exact same situation, and they find themselves held to ransom, often by private landlords, that they don't have any rights. And what we're seeing is more and more there's a kind of a growing population of people in Galway City who feel like as if they're in a limbo when they move into a house, that they could be there for a year, they could be there for 2 years, or they could be turfed out next week. And I think what it comes down to there is, and I said this in my opening speeches, is there's an absolute over-reliance on the private sector. And obviously other candidates here have said a similar thing. When you think about the housing assistance payment, it doesn't cover a single house in the city. The fact that Fine Gael and the government have pushed more money towards that, it clearly shows that the only measures that have been put forward to alleviate the housing crisis has been to turn towards the private sector. People for Profit have been quite adamant. In Dublin, in other parts of the country, we've kind of consistently stood for building public housing on public land. I think what it has to come down to is that there's a speculation on the price of land around Ireland at the moment, and especially in Galway. And when we talk about building houses, and we talk about land, and we talk about cooperatives around Galway who've been trying to look for land off the council for years to build their own houses, it's impossible for a lot of these for cooperatives to do it. It's impossible for families to build their own houses because of the price of land. And I think when we talk about housing, you can't talk about housing without talking about the planning, the national planning policy that's in place, and also the price of land as well at the same time. But I do want to focus on something like Airbnb, because that comes up every single evening when I'm out.
Really?
Every single evening. And I mean, what people are saying is there's entire houses in the city that are entirely rented out to tourists, or you have people where, you go into a house, there's mixed tenancies, there's 2 people living in the house who are renting off the private landlord, and then the other 2 bedrooms are Airbnb. Now, I don't know how other people view communities or view a sense of home. I can't imagine you'd have a sense of home where there's 2 people in your house who are tourists who are constantly moving in and out. What we're seeing there is a hollowing out of the city, and this is where it comes. And this is where we start to talk. but this is where we have to kind of talk about what Eamon's saying and what others are saying in relation to the county. I mean, we're seeing a lot of younger people now, younger couples moving out into the county because that's the only place that they can afford, or the only place where their HAP payment will get them a house. And at the same time, you're seeing... And then they're commuting. But then at the same time, you're seeing a lot of people who are from the county areas moving into the city and competing with a whole host of people. And so what we've seen we saw it came up in the local elections, and it'll come up here again, is a massive competition of needs between various groups of people. And then to talk about the most vulnerable, and again, this is my work, I suppose, my 9-to-5 work I do on a daily basis, is we have a whole section of people who do not see a consistency in the decision making when it comes to the housing list, the social housing list, the homelessness list, and the giving of HAP. There's no consistency in it. People can be at the top of the list. So how do we
fix that? How do we change that?
I think fundamentally there has to be a bringing down of a lot of the bureaucracy at local level. I think what we see is there's an amount of delivery of housing at local level has been, because local authorities have had their hands tied and a lot of the power has been taken away from them, I think there has to be more of a say from a national level about what local authorities can do in relation to streamlining when it comes to housing and homelessness lists, and also, to be honest, it has to be a pull away from the delivering of HAP. It has to be back towards public housing, and we have to kind of come back towards.
And when you say public housing, you're talking about social.
I am.
I socially owned houses.
And socially owned houses, and I think to echo what you were saying earlier, and we have this in our manifesto.
Well,
we believe.
I'm only asking questions.
I understand.
Here
No,
now.
but we're saying that there should be one-off social housing in the county as well. I mean, I don't understand why that can't be a thing. Like that should be happening. And when you think about it, there's 3,600 empty buildings across this city and county. Now, people can say, depending on what various types of ownership these buildings have, but in a housing crisis that is nation-changing.
Yes, the census has said that very clearly.
Yeah,
There's
it's
up
very
to 10% of empty houses in Galway.
Why can't we be compulsory purchasing these houses? Why can't we introduce a
But the
vacant
normal in the
levy on
UK
these
is
buildings?
1%.
Yeah.
You know, there are a lot of empty houses.
It's completely out of the ordinary. It's completely out of the
I
ordinary.
know everybody wants to come back on that, but I want to sort of segue quickly into transport as well. So come back on housing if you will, but just obviously the housing situation is causing traffic chaos. It's causing transport problems in the city particularly. And I was talking to Eamon earlier. He was suggesting that there's a lot of issues, particularly on the road out to Clifton, in relation to transport, that the actual transport route out there has problems. So if we could try and address the transport issue as well, I'd be grateful. So keep going.
To segue into it again, when the Crown Plaza a development was announced, us ourselves and people for profit were quick to say, why, when there's great announcement and hullabaloo over all these things that happen in the city, but there's never any accounting, there's never any idea that the private developer or the private company who's building this has to account for the massive increase in transport that's going to happen, and then no one actually talks about it. And we kind of pointed that out, and so when we're on the doorsteps now, what we're seeing is it's obviously again a myriad of issues. The car owners want to leave their cars at home but don't have any option to do that, so a lot of them have a bike, a lot of them are keen walkers, but don't actually see ways of leaving the car at home. And then when it comes to public transport, and I mean, again, like a lot of people, I don't own a car. I'm a walker, so very often when I have to get out,
actually 25% of people in Galway City travel in and out of work, school, or university by walking.
Yeah.
So it's extraordinary.
I often think
it's the second biggest.
We're the third-class citizens. I often say in Galway, we kind of get forgotten about. We're the ones who are left walking on the roads because there's cars and vans parked up on the footpaths. I think it comes down to when we're free and frequent public transport, and people go, that's radical. It's not. It's been tried in other countries. It's working in other parts of Europe. People will only use public transport if they see it as reliable, if they see it as getting them to A to B on time, and if they see it as a genuine alternative and substitute from them being stuck in traffic in a car.
Okay, I want to give Niall a chance to come back now on the issue of housing and...
Yeah, and I'll link it into transport as well, because it's really intertwined. So the first thing I just say about housing is that really we have a two-tier housing system in Ireland. So we have a two-tier health system, we have a two-tier housing system. And what I mean by that is if you have an income level of 100 grand or more in your family, the private sector will take care of your housing needs. And there used to be a time when the cost of housing was around 4 or 5 times the average salary. Now it's up around 8, 9, 10 times. So basically what's happening for young people today is you have to have 2 jobs to be able to, 2 good paying jobs to be able to afford a house in the private market. And if you're lucky enough to have that, then you've no time to spend with your kids, to spend with your, to follow your passion and interest. If you're not lucky to have that, you're on your own. And it's a 2-tier housing market, and the way we have to solve that is we need to start building 200 grand houses again, like the same way
200 grand houses.
Yeah, like we need to get the price of housing down, and the way that we can do that is
now you're not talking about shoddy jerry-built houses.
No, I'm talking about good standard, but we can get the cost
down.
You're
talking about the cost of land coming down.
Yeah, you're talking about the cost of land coming down. We're talking about like building at scale, the way we did in the past. We're talking about getting the absolutely. We're talking about getting the cost of financing down, and the state can borrow cheaper than the private sector can. The taxes that developers pay, obviously it's a net zero for the state. So there are all these ways that if we build at a state level, that we can get the cost of housing down. And then I think that we should be building at scale. I think linking it back to transport, it's very important that we build up Galway City. And that we aren't a modern city in that it's gone out and out and out. And I think really there's been a huge political failure in Galway to plan the city properly over the last 10, 20 years. And that has locked in massive commutes for people.
So you're talking about planning as really a key.
Yeah, and to build up the city centre with good quality apartments. So say my wife is from Portugal. and her parents both live in the city centre in lovely apartments. If you walked into them, it would be just like a lovely home that someone would have out in Knocknacar or wherever. You wouldn't feel like you were in a kind of a crappy apartment that we built during the boom times. And just to Eamon's point about the rental, I think what people really want is they want to know that they're going to be able to live the rest of their lives in that home.
Okay.
And say my mother-in-law in Portugal has rented an apartment her entire life. Like she's been in her same apartment for 30 years. She'll live the rest of her life in that apartment. She has absolutely no need to buy an apartment. I think here we need that security by ownership. But we can change that, but it needs legislative change to give renters better rights.
Okay.
I think though that when you look at you can run the country the way you think people should be, or you can run the country for the way people actually are. Now, obviously, people change over time, but my experience is that in Ireland, maybe because of our history, there is a huge desire to own a house or to own an apartment. But a lot of people, and I see this in Dublin, when they come to a certain stage of their life, when they're younger, yes, the apartment's ideal. But when they have families, they like to own their house. Now, whether that's right,
you may be saying there's a huge desire, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's in the public good. And government isn't just about
let's come
the
at let's look at the transport issue.
A small
right?
number of people.
Let's look at the transport issue.
Yes,
I am a huge proponent. I'm a huge proponent of public transport.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, with the NTA, it's incredibly slow to get any change. But for example, there was no bus leaving Galway on the Carrow Road, which is one of the most populous roads in the county, and there's no way to go into Galway except to come down on the one road, as you know.
But I mean, you've been in government for
let me finish.
Quite a while now.
A year and a half of hard work. A year and a half of hard work, and we've got 3 night services: one at 7, one at 9, and one at 11. Now that is a huge revolution in terms of the NTA. To me, it's a baby step. There actually should be half-hourly buses right up to 11 o'clock at night going west. Now, the second thing...
Going out to Clifton?
No, going out to Carrow.
Carrow.
Now, similarly, going out to Clifton.
Yeah.
Now, the second thing you have to do, of course, if you want to give bus priority, is have roads that can give bus priority, which unfortunately there's no chance of doing in the Cushariga Road, but there is, with the improvements being made to the N59, there is the possibility of putting dedicated bus lanes so that it gets in faster. Therefore, you give the advantage of public transport. I also have to say, I remember Micheál McGrail, who had campaigned to retain the Western Rail Corridor, and only for him it wouldn't exist at all. I was very supportive of that. I said to him about 10 years ago, the future is in commuter rail. And I have campaigned consistently on this, and there is now a commitment by Iarn Rodair to prioritise putting a passing loop in Oramore. Now, to put it in simple English, what that means is the maximum frequency of trains you can bring into Galway in any one direction at the moment is 40 minutes. That would reduce it to a quarter of an hour. And for the first time, you could have proper commuting from Ennis up through Gort and into Galway, and from Athlone into Galway. We need that urgently. And we also need to open the railway line connecting Mayo into Galway through the Western Rail Corridor, through Claremorris, into Tuam and into Galway. And we need those leaps of faith, and we have to forget about the economists who tell you it's not economic or whatever. 200 million would build it. That won't build much motorway for you.
Okay. I want to give Pauline a chance to respond to that because she's been trying to get in for a while here.
Thanks. I mean, there's a lot of points have come up there, really. I mean, firstly, in relation to short-term lettings and Airbnb and specifically, and I've spoken a lot on this nationally, this issue particularly for Galway, because we've had the highest increase in homelessness in Galway compared to the rest of the country. And whether we can say that people are willfully ignoring it or that people don't understand, but there's a regulation that people have to actually look for change of use if they are using their premises as a business, and that's effectively what Airbnb is. And I go down streets in Galway all of the time, and it's Airbnb, Airbnb, Airbnb. It's not just the fact that we have homeless, it's the fact that actually it's where we need the people to be living in order to create.
There's only 4 of them registered, I believe.
There's only 4. So I asked.
3, 4.
Well,
I won't argue
well,
that
no.
much.
Well, I asked for the figures on that, and 4 had looked for. 3 had looked for a change of use, and 1 was a new premises. So it's actually the total is 4 there.
So why is that, Pauline? I mean, why is that
well,
happening? You're on the
there's
council.
it's very, very difficult to enforce. You know, it is incredibly difficult to enforce.
But why?
Because you're talking about individual properties, and you're talking about people within the council. Councils are completely underfunded as it is, and what we need
But
to
is
do.
there no enforcement officer
There are
in-
enforcement
in
officers.
the county, and they've only enforced 4?
It was
The-
also
the-
very poor legislation.
Yeah.
But it was never designed. It wasn't designed to be.
Well, I'll just speak on it for a minute because I have a few things to say. So it's that, but it's also, it's not just enforcing individual properties, it's actually enforcing the entire system. We have to look at those people who are advertising, like Airbnb. It's going after those companies because they wouldn't actually be able to rent out their properties if it wasn't for these large corporations who are making money out of them and who are making money out of them, and it's not coming back into the city. But it's an overall planning issue for Galway City that we aren't regulating how our tourists are staying in the city. We're seeing a hollowing out of the city centre. We are seeing that we're being forced into having more and more car parks in the city centre where people are supposed to be living. And this all comes back to the transport issue. Eamon rightly point out that there are very few buses going out to Carrow, out to Clifton, and even yesterday I was in Spiddle and saw people standing there. Now, it wasn't raining yesterday, but it could easily have been raining, and most people are not going to stand there and wait for a bus. They have no idea when the bus is coming. Because there's no digital display, there's no bus shelters. Some
Is
of those
there
things are very.
demand?
There is demand. There's absolutely huge
Yeah,
demand.
I would have thought so.
Huge demand, and I
And
mean,
yet it isn't happening.
No,
My
and
understanding is people are hogging the routes, or certain companies are.
No, that's not it.
Is that
It's
not
totally
true?
under control of the NTA.
It
For
is.
example, the Carrow route is a bus airing route.
Yeah.
And they did ask, it's nearly 2 years ago now, for permission for extra buses. And it took a year and a half for the NTA to make a decision that should have been made in 24 hours.
And,
Okay, I
and,
want
and,
to
to be,
let Pauline
and to
finish
be
now.
honest, it's not just about licences, because what I hear all of the time is we've issued a licence for there and nobody's taken it up. But actually, public transport is about a social good. It's not just about issuing a licence to a company to make money out of that
So
route.
what's stopping it?
So what's stopping it is in large part the NTA is stopping a lot of that.
And why?
And because we don't have a strong enough government that is actually pushing public transport as the primary good, and also we're seeing more and more estates going in. Letter Road, Ballymoneen Road, estate after estate, and you look at the planning permission and I look at them in detail, and there's no provision there for a bus, no provision for a cycle lane, no provision for a footpath. I see children who cannot leave their estates to cross the road to go to friends, and we should absolutely refuse to allow the developments to go ahead without transport being put in first. That's an absolute must that we have that put in first.
But I've heard these issues coming up election after election, and I'm not going to say that the people who were elected were incompetent. They weren't. You know, we've had good politicians elected in the main, and yet these issues aren't resolved. So something must be blocking this. I mean, you know, how do we...
I would have to say, my experience in the last few years is an absolute total inability of nearly every agency to make decisions. We just seem to tie everything up in endless red tape. The simplest things gets tied up. Now, what we need within the city are 10-minute buses in all directions. We need them to extend to Barna, to Mycullen, to Clare Galway. Oramore has a half-hour bus, but we need it even more frequently. But to just do that much, you think that's obvious.
But sure, no
simple.
politician disagrees with that.
Yeah, exactly. The problem is, and this is where all you waste all your time, but you have to keep wasting, is badgering and asking questions about the same simple thing until you win. And one of the problems that I found, particularly on the public transport in the last 4 years, is that it takes, you're working on 2 or 3 issues, because if you try to work on 10 issues that seem self-evident to you, at the one time you get nowhere, because you literally have to painstakingly tread every issue through. And you're the biggest... I put it this way to you. Most people have the same policy. We all want public transport. The real question in this election isn't, necessarily about big policy issue. It's who can actually get the job done. And one of the interesting analogies you could draw is every football team wants to win the championship they're in. But the real question is who's got the best team and the best management to actually achieve
your
it.
colleague Ollie Crow reckons he has the solution to all the transport problems. He wants to build a bypass, and he reckons that's going to sort it out, just as your colleague Frank Fahey did before, and he's now...
Well, I have to
disappeared
say
into
that the NTA
mists.
report tells you, if you want, which I think most of us want, preferably rail rapid transport through the city. that you have to actually build the bypass to create the space to do these things.
And is that going to solve the problem on its own?
No, you have to do both. No, in
So
other
why are
words,
we not talking about the second one?
well,
certainly
I have
the
been
Fianna Fáil or Fine
consistently,
Gael
I have
parties
been
are not.
consistently talking about
I'll
the
give you
second
that,
one,
Eamon,
and
but it's not on the
I'm
government
Fianna
agenda.
Fáil. I went to the bother of bringing the NTA report and held this with me, and I read it very, very carefully. I looked at the statistics. It seemed to make sense to me. But one other thing I think we should say about roads, there has been an absolute explosion of people travelling by bus to Dublin in the last 10 or 15 years.
Absolutely,
And
since the motorway.
since the motorway opened. So this idea that roads, don't facilitate, or good roads don't facilitate public transport, of course they do. So let's take a simple example. If we take the South Connemara Road, if you had a width that you could put a dedicated bus lane in, I think you would get 5 times as many people on public
But
transport.
there are no buses going over the Quincentenary Bridge.
Yeah.
There are no significant
that's true.
transport. There's no buses going,
Well,
as you said, out to Clifton. There's no buses, or at least a
I-
small
there-
number.
yeah, and one of the
We need to have them on the roads.
But one of the
for them to work.
factors, yes, absolutely, and one of the factors that people forget about in talking about traffic in Galway City is that half of the people working in the east of the city come from the county area every day. So if you could divert those somewhere along the line into public transport, you actually do an incredible amount to solve the city
Look,
traffic
I just
problem.
quickly want to get one last thing, which is that the Greens are, and I want to come to Pauline in a sec. The Greens are proposing light rail, through the city. You seem to be suggesting that we do need a rail, across city rail
preferably, yes,
transport,
of course, because
but your party doesn't seem to agree with that.
Well, what I of course agree with it. It's more. I want rapid transit of some type, right?
Rail or bus.
is preferable because I've seen it obviously in Dublin. Now, when I go to Dublin, we were talking about obviously where I live. I use the car, but when I go to Dublin, I park in Leinster House, and whether I'm staying with my sister-in-law out in Geraghty or I'm staying where I grew up which is within walking distance Leinster House, I never take the car. And if we're going anywhere else in the city that there's public transport available, whether it's out to Tal or whatever, I always take public transport or I walk.
Okay.
So I have a fair good walking range because I like walking, and that is the way we need to go.
Okay, we have to give the other candidates a chance to have their say, and back to Pauline as well, because she was cut off.
Perfect. So I think there's 2 really important questions in this election, and it's particularly when it comes up to these things around what are our priorities for the future in Galway and in Ireland. So one is, how are you going to pay for it? And I think it's one really important thing that we need to look at is like.
Are you going to pay for what?
Well, for public transport, for roads, for
200 million to put a tunnel underneath the city is what's being proposed in the latest.
And I'll come on to that in a second. It's really important that that political parties aren't going around promising tax cuts and then saying they're going to solve every single problem. And I think we're like Social Democrats have tried to be honest since the 2016 election that we can't afford huge tax cuts and then solve all these problems. I think just as importantly as how do you pay for it, is how do you get value for money out of the public money. And I think there's been huge wastage in public money over the last 5, 10, 20 years. And this is this transport is just a perfect example of it here in Galway. So I think if you look at I would absolutely love to have a light rail going through Galway, but if you look at the cost of putting that in, and if you look at the cost of the bypass, and if you look at the cost of investing,
250 million is what the latest report has suggested would cost for a light rail line across the city. The bypass is currently at 700 million, including 200 million to put a tunnel under the racecourse. So I mean, surely relatively, which is going to give the best?
Well, the best bang for bus for
is it not
buck
both,
is
as Eamon
bus.
said?
Is bus.
Bus.
The best thing that we can put in is bus lanes.
Now.
Improve bus service and improve cycle lanes. We need to plan our city better so people can walk to work, and that's the absolute best way that we can spend money. Where you find light rail works is in higher densities, like European cities. So like Cosenza in Italy. That if you look around that's 5 or 6 stories of apartments. So if you take a 5-10 minute walking circle around a light rail system or a light rail stop, and those are expensive to put in, there's a huge number of people living in that area. If you take a 5-minute, 10-minute walking circle around a place in Galway, it's a tiny fraction of that population in Galway.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted a quick comment on the just the overall thing, and I think sometimes this has to be painfully pointed out. Obviously, the National Transport Authority are very difficult to deal with, and obviously there's some of these agencies, government agencies, are kind of proposals are put to them, they don't act on them. But I'm sorry. At the end of the day, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael have been in power. Fine Gael have been in power, backed up by Fianna Fáil and a confident to supply agreement. And it's interesting how issues of public transport and public housing come up when there's an election. Now, fair enough, Eamon, you may be a rebel in your party, you may speak out certain times about certain things, but your party and Fine Gael never prioritise these issues. And if anything, it's the complete lack of political will, plus the lobbying of private companies on organisations like NTA and other agencies that stop a lot of these things happening in the first place. I know we should focus on Galway, but it's very difficult to focus on Galway without looking at the national picture. And I just think, we can constantly, you've seen this at local level as well, but people constantly point at the CEO or the local authority and going, it's his fault for nothing happening, or it's the NTA's fault. It's not. It's the government's fault for failing to consult communities about the importance of public transport well before it became a massive issue. A lot of these things that we've been talking about have been talked by election candidates from back when I was only a child in Galway, and they're still being talked about now. For me, it's a lack of political will rather than constantly pointing the finger at the National Transport Authority.
Sorry, could I just come to Pauline here, because the Greens have a possibility of being in government, and I mean, what would be, in terms of transport, what would you see as the solutions for Galway City in particular?
Well, look, the first thing to say is it requires massive investment, and that means we have to divert things and we have to change the way that we're investing. And I mean, I would entirely disagree that light rail is not possible for Galway. Entirely disagree. And I think that really what people don't seem to realise is that putting in transport first means that then that builds the community, then that builds the type of planning that you're looking for. If we don't put these things in, and we know that Galway is set to increase, the target is an additional 50% of a population increase for Galway City. Well, we have to now, that this is exactly the point. Where is that going to be? And we have to now put the transport links, because otherwise we will have more and more sprawl happening in this city, and I see it all of the time on the council and the type of planning that goes in. We're even looking at the Ardán this week, and no new bus services. We absolutely need rapid transit bus. We need 10-minute buses to be going on all of the routes. We need cycle lanes. We need, and this is in our manifesto, 10% for walkability, 10% for cycling. That's what I hear day after day, door after door, cycling, greenways, and nobody is prioritising those. And no matter how many times people talk,
greenways aren't very expensive to put in.
They're not expensive. They're not expensive. And
you hear 700 million for roads.
And I'd say one of the biggest problems there is if we look at Waterford and how quickly it was done in Waterford, and we can see what has happened here is vested interests and a lack of consultation with ordinary people at the very start, and then you create this monstrous idea, a notion that becomes scary for people.
Just before we go back to Eamon and Pauline, just one thing about why haven't other options been tried, do you reckon, even from City Council at your time? Park and Ride, I haven't heard mentioned at all today.
Well, Park and Ride is a very interesting one, because that is something now. I'm working with Alistair McKinstry, who's our councillor in South Connemara, on this, because there's definitely the space in Moycullen in particular for Park and Ride. And I know myself that the buses are also full by the time they get to Moycullen, so it also requires massive
Eamon is nodding.
And Eamon knows all of these problems because they come at his door all the time, I'm sure. We need massive investment in the buses as well as the Park and Ride.
And we need different areas of Park and Ride, not just in Moycullen. We need Uachtarard,
Barna, and if we could do it a little bit outside of Barna, we can get Furbo as well linked into that, and we've seen it work really well in Oranmore. But I mean, I've questioned the transport department here locally on that issue of Park and Ride, and they're saying, because with small children it's too expensive for me to take the bus. Now I take it, but it's more expensive to take the bus with children than it is to drive and park in the city.
Surely we could get these done very quickly, the solutions
you
you're
would
talking
think so.
about.
You
Chinese
would think
are
so.
building hospitals in a few
6
weeks.
days.
6 days, is it? It
Well,
shows
one
what
other
can be
point.
done.
One other point I'd like to raise. You mentioned the NTA,
Eamon, I think.
and I agree totally with you on the NTA that they stop an awful lot of stuff. And something that's been brought up many times is T3. Now, I think at council level, there's an awful lot of small things that can be done to alleviate traffic problems, and they've not been looked at, and they've not been tackled by successive councils and governments. So, Eamon, do you want to have a chat?
Yeah, the one that seems very obvious to me is there's actually a tunnel going under the Bohan Moor. It leads out to the bridge across the Cuív. The stanchions are still there, and I'm told they're perfectly secure. We need to urgently connect the university that way into the centre of the city. It'd be an absolutely fantastic shortcut, and most of the basic infrastructure is there. So there's lots of things we can do. I agree with the quick win approach to these issues.
Yes, I've heard you talk about that before, and people talk about sort of, a corridor between Parkmore and Ballybrit would alleviate a lot of traffic, for example.
Exactly.
Why don't we focus on the quick wins?
But the one thing I'd say, Joe, in answer to you, as a minister, I had responsibility for the Gaeltacht and the islands, very, very specifically in rural areas. I think if you ask people on the ground, they would say, one, things did happen that had been waiting around for 100 years. Now, there was an ironic one, because you control things at Fianna Fáil, and that's fair enough. I have no problem with that.
You have been in
I always remember one particular pier I built in the Turk, or I got as minister, was built during my time, and I was determined to build because they had no good pier. Apparently, Eamon de Valera, no less, had promised that back in the late 40s.
No relation. And it wasn't going to inhibit me that he had failed to do the job. I was very proud to eventually get round to doing the job that a lot of others had promised. So I think my record will stand on getting things done in the portfolios I was given. And that sounds a bit Boris Johnson,
well, yes,
if you don't mind saying.
But it is a
done.
fact. So you ask people, as I said, in the Gaeltacht about the various needs they had, and the people on the islands, and the people in very rural areas. I was in a cluster of houses last night where they have to test the water every year because they're on wells. We were extended water schemes all over the rural areas that are connected to mains to guarantee high quality water, which is a basic right from a public service to all of these houses, and we did it at an affordable cost, and the cost of the exchequer was absolutely minimal. Can I just say one thing, Neil? If you look at the rail services in Dublin, the Luas line is jam-packed every morning.
That's true.
Also the Dart line, which I often go on in the morning, is absolutely jam-packed. Now the reality is both of those are in low density housing areas. The Luas line, in fact, not the Luas line but the Dart line, as you go out and you look, as you're going out on the left-hand side, actually it's serving an area of zero density housing, because on the left-hand side is the sea.
And don't forget, people said both of those wouldn't work beforehand.
No.
And now they do.
And
they would never get rid of them.
Tragedies, and this is where the Western Rail Corridor comes in, one of the tragedies was that they had to buy all the land back from the Harcourt Street railway line that had been sold back in 1960. And, the reality is, again, use what's there, build on it, and move fast, and preserve public ownership. There is one difference between Waterford and the Greenways. I actually started the Greenway policy. I was instrumental in persuading Mayo County Council to start the first Greenway to Achill. I was looking at these old abandoned railway lines and saying, a fantastic opportunity. But there was one difference. I met Éireann Road Éireann, and they owned the railway line from Limerick to Tralee. And they still own the railway line from Tralee to Feenet and from Waterford to Dungarvan. And therefore they were very easy takes, and they're virtually, well, two of them are nearly done. They were easy takes because the state was in private ownership, was in public ownership, belonged to Éireann Road Éireann. I had a huge problem. I had endless meetings with Éireann Road Éireann and say, will you protect your right of way? And I'm still on to it all the way up to Collooney, to protect state property. And I can say that when I was responsible for Waterways Ireland, they own a lot of dried canals and so on. It's not all water. And I, again, was very, very strong with them that they had to protect all the state-owned land from encroachment by anybody, because it doesn't belong to them, it belongs to the people.
Okay, we've got a few minutes left. I want to move on, if I may, to it would be remiss of me if I didn't bring up the issues of the environment and climate change, because transport and housing all have implications for environment, and it is something which I believe is very much to the fore nowadays, especially with Greta Thunberg and various other people are talking a lot about it. It's becoming quite a systemic issue. So I suppose I'd like to start with people other than Pauline to find out, is climate change, I suspect you do have climate change coming up on the doors, Pauline, I'm sure, but people know you're a Green candidate and they will bring it up. But is it coming up for you, Niall?
Yeah, it absolutely is. For me, it's a very personal issue. I have a 6-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I'm anxious about the planet that I brought them into. And we can build a social utopia, and if we don't have a planet to live it on in 20, 30 years, then what's the point? And so I think it's very important that Ireland takes huge action. Now, obviously, like, we can solve the local environmental issues here locally, but there's a massive global issue. And so we have to think around what's the role that we can play globally. And we need to get, first, if we get our emissions down through like improving our housing stock, through investing in public transport, through improving the environmental sustainability of our agriculture, and if we get our emissions way down, then we can go out, and if we do it in a fair way. And it's really important that as we get our emissions down, that we do it in a way that's socially responsible and sustainable and fair to people and doesn't overburden the poorest in society with the cost of it. If we can go out and do that, and then we can go and tell the world how we did it, I think that's the role that we can play. If we get the model right here, then we can go out and show the world how we do it.
Okay.
But we have to do it now, and we have to do it credibly.
Joe, what about yourself?
Yeah, I mean, like, again, on the doors, when it comes up, the main thing that people are saying is obviously something needs to be done, and my party have been quite clear in, putting forward bills in the Dáil, which unfortunately have been blocked by various money messages and other apparatus that Fine Gael and other parties have engaged in. But what's clear from a lot of people is they want action on climate change, but people feel like as if working class people are unfairly targeted with some of the policies that some parties put forward. And we've been quite clear and adamant about this, is that when it came to the water charges campaign, which was something I was heavily involved in, the anti-water charges campaign, the reason that was ultimately defeated was a lot of people said, why are we being asked to pay when the vast majority of leaks in our system are coming from businesses and from the private sector? It's not coming from residential and individual households. And then the same thing comes down to climate change. Obviously, we all have all our own responsibilities, and obviously as a party and as a candidate, we're promoting more green solutions to living a life. But I think when we talk about money that's needed to bring about environmental proposals, the tax should be aimed at those who are causing the largest amounts of pollution. It should be at the major corporations.
So you're saying let's do something now so long as somebody else pays?
I'm saying there should be no carbon tax on working people. There should be a carbon tax on big business and big corporations. I think that's the way it should be forward.
If you put the carbon tax on big business, you know what they're going to do?
But this has been said all the time. But unfortunately, I mean, we live in a society where we have a 12.5% corporation tax that's not enforced. Yet the rest of us working people, if we refused to pay 1 cent of any of our taxes, we're hauled off to jail. Large corporations, and then there's this thing put out there that these companies will just flee and that they'll leave. That's not true. And anyway, why do we as a city and why do we as a country push the interests of multinationals over small, independent and artisan businesses in our city and our county? I think when we're talking about, Eamon, I think when it comes to something like carbon tax, and we've been quite adamant about this, is I don't even like using that expression. There needs to be taxes and measures put in place that addresses climate change, but they need to be aimed at corporations and the large polluters and not at everyday ordinary working people.
But in the end of the day, it'll trickle down. I absolutely agree with you. The 12.5% tax should be absolutely rigidly enforced. My understanding is revenue do that. Yeah. Revenue do that. There are technical reasons. There are technical reasons why, if you wound up in government, you probably wouldn't be in such a hurry to increase it in the short term.
I'd say I would.
Yeah, but you'd find that there are downsides in relation to that, because one of the issues we have to look at is that where you have large employment, there are a lot of taxes paid of every type. It generates a lot of revenue for the state, not only corporation tax but other taxes as well. But to go on the green agenda, I think the first thing I would say is, when we look at houses, the most people who spend time in houses are old people and people who've got a disability. They should get absolute priority in retrofitting, because
and children.
And children, but children tend to be out of school and tend to be more active, and they don't have the same vulnerability to the cold as people who are less mobile. Certainly when I was growing up, that was the way it was. And the reality is that we need to ensure that they get the priorities for 2 reasons: from an environment point of view and from a human point of view. The second thing is, if there is a carbon tax, the benefit must spread across all communities, and different communities have different needs into how they might reduce the carbon tax within the community. So there's a big agenda here. I think everyone agrees on the agenda. But I find totally frustrating is we get grandiose plans, but we're not getting an awful lot of action. And again, we're back from the big policy we all agree on, who can actually get the thing to happen.
Okay, now what I want to ask Pauline in particular, because obviously if the Greens get into government, there'll be a big emphasis on climate change. But how can we actually solve problems in terms of bring down our emissions without it affecting ordinary people in their pockets?
Look, I mean, my background is all in social care. Like, that's where I've come from. My degree is sociology. I've worked in community activism all my life, starting a school, community preschool, running an outdoor playgroup, none of it to benefit my own family, all to benefit other people. So I absolutely would not put my hand up for policies that weren't people-centred. And you know, we are not
even if the environment suffers.
We are not in agreement with carbon tax. Like, I mean, people hear green this, green that, and they think, oh, that's the Green Party. It's not the Green Party. That's Fine Gael. Fine Gael believe in a carbon tax for individuals. We believe in taxing corporations and that going in a dividend straight to people. No, hold on a second. No.
Ryan was adamant.
Yeah.
With John Gormley about introducing a carbon tax when we were in government.
Well, I'm in the party now, and we have activists. We are predominantly an activist party, and I can absolutely assure you we're the most democratic party that there is. All of our parties come from the people.
Do I hear a future leadership bid there, Pauline?
Look, Eamon is also very clear on our policy, which is developed by the party, and it is a carbon dividend model.
The West's awake.
However, the West is awake, and you'll find very strong women all over the west of Ireland running for the Dáil. And look, in the end of the day, it has to be a fair model. Absolutely, I would agree with Eamon that when you tax corporations, it does trickle down to people. And so what we want to do is predominantly stop the energy use. It's not just about moving over to a different energy model, it's stopping the energy use so that energy poverty isn't an issue for people. That means massive investment in retrofitting, and it also means massively giving people the money to do that.
Do you expect corporations to pay for all of that? I mean, levying corporations.
No. Let me be clear on that. The corporation, the carbon dividend is only a very, very minute part of the problem, and it can't be so high that it will really impact on people in terms of their fuel prices. What we really need to do is look at, how can we save money? And we've already done a model where we've shown how much money is leaking out of the system because we're paying for our emissions. And so this is what we're really saying. We borrow at a very low rate, which we can do as local authorities and as a government, borrow at a very low rate and really massively invest in re-wetting our bogs. 20% of our land is bogs. There's carbon sequestration in that, in increasing our forestry cover from 11% to 30%, and investing in farmers who are the stewards of this land and who are absolutely key to this new economy. And it is an economy, and it can be a booming economy, and it can really redevelop rural parts of the county. And it can, if we look at the greenways, which Eamon has already spoken about, that is bringing economy to local areas as well. So all of this, I believe passionately, we need a practical approach. We need people who have actually done things throughout the year, throughout their lives, for their communities. But we also need to have the big policies so that we're planning for something, and we're planning long term.
Okay, we promised we'd get you out of here by 11:30. So what we'll have to do, I think,
12 even.
Or sorry, 12 even. I can't. I must be in European. Whichever way round it is, Icelandic time. I don't know. Anyway. We'd like to give you each a chance just to really sort of reflect on what we've discussed here, but maybe to give people a clue as to why they should elect you rather than anybody else, because we need to know what your particular individual passions are. So I suppose we start with Joe. He's always a passionate man.
Just on the conversation, obviously public services and the environment, obviously the priority there, and I think we need to be looking towards candidates that prioritise the protection of our public services over privatisation, and I've demonstrated that throughout my campaigning experience, and also that we have environmental solutions that address everybody, that everybody can get on board, farmers, working people, and where I suppose ultimately the biggest polluters are being punished. My background specifically in relation to community development and anti-racism, and I say this, representing being a candidate for the most multicultural city in the country, and in a country where there's increasing racism and division. I think it's about time that we started to elect people that have a common sense community development approach to that, to trying to integrate into communities, to stop seeing a competition of needs between working people, between students, between immigrants, between the traveller community, and that we start to put forward a plan that is consulted with different communities, a national action plan against racism that deals with, I suppose, the varying aspects of diversity and immigration and all the things that come up over the next while. But just more generally, that we start to look towards a left government. We look towards a left government that is composed of left parties, and that put forward proposals that prioritise public services and protecting the environment over payouts to multinationals and other firms.
Okay, that's good. Joe, we'll bring in Pauline as time is slightly against us.
Thank you.
1 minute, if you may.
Just briefly, I suppose, I believe that the answers to climate and to the biodiversity crisis are actually all of the things that make our lives better. They're public transport, they're buses, they're cycling, they're really investing in local infrastructure to make sure that we're getting primary healthcare, GPs, post offices all up and running, so that people aren't constantly travelling for all of their services. They mean valuing our farmers as stewards of the land, and not going down this route of agribusiness, which is incentivising an economy that really is not putting money back in people's pockets. If we're putting money into anything, we need to be putting it into the future. And I'm hearing all of the time that people really want a better future for their children and their grandchildren, and that's what I stand for.
Okay, Niall?
Thanks. So I suppose I'd ask people to vote for me for a few reasons. So one is because I have good experience in health reform. I have good experience in energy. I've worked on the grids in Portugal and South America, and I know how to get things done and how to improve public services. And I think the second reason I'd ask people to vote for me is because I think we need to have people in there who have values and integrity in politics, and I think that's really missing in politics today. And if you look at, say, the Social Democrats and our two TDs, Roisin Shortall and Catherine Murphy, who have incredible integrity inside and outside of government, and I'd like to continue with that. And I think the third reason, and one that's really important, is that this young generation really have a raw deal and need representation and need people fighting for them at a national level, so that we get the cost of housing, the cost of living down, that we do it in a sustainable way, and that they have a future that they can be hopeful for. So I want to represent and fight for that young generation in the Dáil.
I would hope, first of all, that I have the experience, the energy and the enthusiasm to continue with work that I've been doing for many years, and I have that. The reality is that often on the big policy issues there's a consensus. The question is how you actually get there. And I think one of the things I've learned through my life, through my work in the co-op, creating employment and so on back in Cardamona back in the 80s, was how actually to deliver things with the community, working in a community. Now, you asked what are the issues. The issues are everything that affect any human being. So when you get elected as a TD, you find that people come to you with every kind of problem, whether it's housing, disability, transport, and so on. And you have to try deal right across the spectrum, from the very, very big ticket items to the individual issue that might be affecting somebody. One of the problems I see as a big issue at the moment is how overweening the bureaucracy is, how complicated it is for people to access their rights. Whether they wind up overpaying tax because of an overcomplicated personal tax system, and lots of people don't claim all their allowances as a consequence, or whether they cannot get their social welfare rights, or they don't get the right payments because the system's too complicated and they don't have the detailed knowledge, which a lot of us wouldn't have day to day if we're doing something one-off, to do that. Probably one of the worst cases that I deal with consistently, or worst agencies I deal with, who are totally intolerant of the most vulnerable in our society. That's those who are applying for medical cards. And it's absolutely ridiculous that somebody applies for a medical card and they're asked for further information. If they don't get the answer back in 28 days, and a lot of these will be over 70 and maybe over 80, they have to start all over again and collect the forms. And a lot of people do not keep copies of all the data sent in. So we need also, and you'll find this is a much more pervasive problem than people imagine when you're actually sitting there listening to people day in, day out, struggling with these problems. So yes, climate action needs to be dealt with. Yes, all these big issues have to be dealt with. But in the meantime, people have to live, and we have to look at their needs also.
Okay, Eamon, thanks very much. Well, first of all, guys, thanks very much for coming this morning. I'd like to wish you the best for the rest of the campaign. And I hope the viewers enjoyed it. I think it was a very, very good conversation this morning. I had questions from the public as well, but we ran out of time. So, Neil, you might like to wrap it up?
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Mike. There's been a huge audience this morning. There's many comments actually coming in still at the moment. You know, and I'd ask the candidates here maybe have a quick look at them on Facebook when we're finished and maybe respond to some of them.
That would be great, yeah.
You know, because they would be, some of them directed personally to yourselves. So thank you very much to everybody for watching, and don't forget to like us on Facebook, don't forget to to follow us on Twitter, and don't forget to look at YouTube. You know, Galway Politics Live has been around for only a few months. We're trying to provide a different style of community-based service, you know, different type of political coverage to the main channels, and there's been a huge viewership so far. I mean, we've had over 5,000 views in just a few short months, and a lot more today. So the one thing I would say, and I'm sure you'll all agree on this, who's ever watching, make sure that you get out to vote, whatever party you vote for. I think everybody agrees on that. Make sure you participate in the election. Make your vote count. That's coming up on the 8th of February, a Saturday. So there's no excuse for people not to vote. So, you know, thank you very much for watching, and tune in next Sunday as well. And I think we're broadcasting live on next Friday as well from the Harbour Hotel, when candidates hopefully will be signing pledges for.
So hopefully we'll see you all again on Friday.
Yeah. So listen, thanks very much to all of you. I think it's been a good debate, and I think I'd be very grateful to you all for being very civil about it. Some RTE programmes now, all you can hear is people shouting at each other, and certainly you guys in Galway, I think we're
very well behaved.
I think in Galway we're much more polite people. What do you think?
And I think one thing I would have to say, right across the board, from the so-called left to the so-called right, most politicians, the vast majority of politicians, do their best, work hard, and have integrity. There have been some notable exceptions, but I think of a class of people you'll find, those of us who get elected, that you will be find a genuinely committed group of people there, and I think it's one of the serious damages that has been done to politics by a small number is to undermine people's faith in the efforts that politicians across the board make on behalf of what they see as right.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think we'll close it there, and thank you to our audience. We'll let you go now. So thank you very much. Tune in next Sunday.